Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is a friend and a colleague I've known for almost 40 years, Donald Altman. So first of all, as you know, regular listeners to the show know that Grace Under Pressure focuses on what's often dismissed as the soft stuff, the caring, the commitment that we exist. And when you do it from a leadership position, and you'll definitely discover that my friend Donald Altman is that. You do it with a common cause of bringing people together. Welcome, Donald Altman. It is a pleasure to have you again on my show, Grace Under Pressure.
Well, thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here, and I see that we're actually live. That put a lot of pressure on me when I realized we're live here. So, but I allow myself to screw up because we're human beings, right? We're flawed, and it's okay.
Spoken like a true psychotherapist that you happen to be, Donald Altman. You have been, but today we're going to talk about a different dimension of your career. You are a prolific writer, and I've known you for all these many years when we were both doing marketing communications a good long while ago in the city of Los Angeles. Since then, you have written over 20 books, and you've won numerous awards. You've been profiled in all kinds of places. I have recommended your books, and I use them regularly in my coaching practice. So it is a pleasure to have you on the show. And we are going to be speaking today about your brand new book, which is your first novel, The Travelers. So welcome to the show, Donald Altman.
Oh, well, thank you, John. And thanks for that wonderful introduction.
Great. Well, I have to quote, it's kind of in line with what you had said about not realizing we were going to be live, because the first line of your new novel, Travelers, says, "Let me start this book with an apology of sorts. You see, I'm a board-certified psychiatrist, not a book writer."
Well, the funny thing is, people have read that, and they thought that it was me, that the psychiatrist in the story was me, and well, this is about you, isn't it? That's you. And I'm like, no, this is fiction.
That's good.
I wouldn't start one of my books with an apology.
Yeah, I know. It's kind of a backhanded way of doing it. You're underselling yourself there. So you have written 20 books, more than that. You've done them, and you teach, you counsel, do all kinds of stuff. Why a novel?
Well, this novel is really a novel about healing. It's really doing a lot of things that I already do in my work, but I felt I could reach people in a new way through a story through a fictional story, and take them into the world of a psychiatric hospital. And that's something a lot of people have never maybe experienced or don't know what it's like in there. And that part of the book is I hope it's realistic, but it takes people into that world of therapy and mental illness. And I think what's happened is we become very kind of mechanical in the treatment of patients. And we're kind of in a stranglehold of materialism and a materialistic view when working with patients. And I think we need to broaden that out and bring in the spiritual sense of who we are and the sense of wholeness that we contain as a person, and to not treat people, as a widget, so to speak.
Well, that's thank you for that. And that's a concept which is often hurled and applied to surgery, but I haven't heard it applied to the mental health field. But yet, having worked in it, do you see that sometimes the system or puts people into boxes, and rather than looks at them as whole people? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah. Well, very much so. I mean, and you go into surgery, we can replace a hip, we can replace different parts of the body, but how do you replace an emotion, right? How do you replace complex brain architecture and how we react to things? Not so simple. And so, that's what I'm talking about, is that how can we find a new way of approaching mental health, mental illness even?
Well, you touched on the spiritual side, and I know you have come from a Buddhist tradition. You were once a Buddhist monk, so this sense of spirituality is very evident in the book. It's not just our cognitive realm. There's something more to it. So, how were you able to explore spirituality in the book? I'm sorry, in fiction that you did not do in fiction. So,
Well, in Travelers, what I did was the main character, the psychiatrist, he's actually gone through a devastating loss. He's dealing with the agonizing loss of a child, his daughter, who was adolescent, and it's driven a wedge between him and his wife. It's affecting all facets of his life, and he's become very, kind of locked into a scientific view of seeing things. And he's tried to see, is there another way to connect with her? Is there such a thing as life after death and so forth? But it's only until he actually experiences. And in the book, he is a guide, a kind of a mystical, mysterious, she's a traveling pet therapist, actually, who he meets called Traveler Jackie. And she's got a sentient dog, a little spaniel that, hangs out on her shoulder all the time. And then a suicidal young man who comes to the clinic who also has experiences of seeing this traveler. And so he is forced to go out of his comfort zone and open up himself. And, one of the things that his guide, this Traveler Jackie, ends up being kind of a guide for him, keeps telling him is he has to learn how to be silent, right? Until we could find stillness in ourselves, it's hard to make that connection to the deeper spiritual self and the mysteries that are within us and without us. And so that was one of his challenges in the story.
Yeah, well, that's fascinating, and there's an overlap in executive coaching, because I think what you talked about with the psychiatrist Ben seeking to explain the world as least as he knew it, and his mental models based on science, of course. But you're arguing that until he let go of that and opened himself to a new experience, that wasn't going to happen. And that's kind of what coaching and therapy is all about. You need to adopt new ways of looking at things, say it, new mental models. Is that correct, Donald?
Oh, that is 100% correct. As long as we're fixed in our belief system or in seeing a certain ways or defending ourselves. So we often defend our ego, right? Until we're able to release that, it's difficult to change. And so this book is also about how do we change? How do we allow ourselves to grow in new ways, even if something might seem frightening to us?
Right. Well, I'm not exactly sure of the time frame of writing this book, but you touch on a theme which is very evident now, and I think a lot of people, we haven't addressed it fully. But as we're coming out of the pandemic, when so many people suffered loss and there was grief. So, what's your perspective on grief? How do we deal with it? Is it something to be overcome, or is it something to be dealt with? So,
I think we can use grief. I think that when we talk about mindfulness actually is a tool to reduce suffering. And people have asked me, so how should I learn mindfulness? Where should I start? And I say, start with where you're struggling, right? Bring your awareness to that. And grief is something it's kind of interesting because, again, in the mental health system, grief has been pathologized a bit. So in the new DSM, it's a diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders. They now have a new disorder called prolonged grief disorder. In other words, if grief lasts longer than a year, you can get insurance to cover that. The good news is, yes, you can get insurance to cover it. The other side, though, it's caused a bit of controversy in the field, is that it's stigmatizing grief. In other words, it's saying, oh, you've got to get over it. It's a year. Come on, move on with things, right? And again, we're complex beings. And in some ways, you could think of grief as a letter of love and caring to the one you've lost that could last a lifetime.
Yeah.
So there's no saying that you must get over it in a particular length of time. We're all different how we process grief.
And that's a good point. I liked how you likened this to a love letter. I had never seen it quite that. And when I talk about grief, I do mention it as a kind of a tribute to the mourning that person. That means that person was important to us. Now, and you talk about grief lasting a lifetime, but the challenge is not to let us debilitate us. Is that what you deal with, Donald? So.
Right. So how can we, like you're kind of talking of it as being kind of a living memorial, right? But we don't want it to overwhelm us to the extent that we can no longer experience joy, that we can't also have our life be meaningful to us. But grief can inform us. It can plant seeds of compassion. It can let us see that, yes, yeah, loss is built in to life, isn't it, in so many different ways. And it really accentuates the idea of how precious this moment is, how precious. Here we are sitting across from each other, even though maybe a couple thousand miles away, and this moment may never come again. So we can appreciate that, that we can connect right here, right now. So I think we need to be aware of the preciousness of each moment.
Right. Now, because you're dealing with fiction, you're able to do some certain things because without giving away the total plot, Dr. Ben does make contact with his deceased daughter. So is there a metaphor you're exploring in that context, Donald? Explain that. So,
well, it's kind of interesting. I mean, and I've talked to some people who have worked in the grief field who actually feel that near-death experiences and other experiences people have had indicate that there is something after this lifetime, that this is a transitional time. I've talked with somebody, a very interesting man called Brian Smith. He's a grief coach, and he lost his daughter, and she was 15 years old. Can't imagine how devastating and heartbreaking that was. But Brian has found that there are different signs and ways that he is able to connect with her spirit. And so he feels that she's with us still. And, it's funny because my own mother was 99. She had a great life. She died at 99. And I always thought, well, I wanted to have a dream or connect with her. And it was several months and nothing happened. And then one day but I wouldn't call it a dream, but it was a vivid experience of being in her presence as I was kind of coming out of sleep and becoming more awake, but she was there, and it had a kind of it wasn't dreamlike. That's all I can say. It had a different kind of vivid awareness, and she didn't speak. And since that time, I've actually, during maybe times when I had to face a challenge in my life, and I would think to myself, okay, what would what my mother say or think, and something would come to me, not in words, but in a feeling. And I think really one of the things that I think can help us all in dealing with grief, or that the travelers in my story learn, is that sometimes we need to get out of our head, right? Our head is built, we got this big frontal cortex, and we're spinning stories all the time, and we get all these thoughts, and we can ruminate and grab onto those ideas, all those thoughts, and they can pull us in different directions. But there's a whole nother way of sensing and experiencing through the body. And so I think there's a real benefit in finding that silence, either maybe communing with nature, taking a breath, and just stepping back, whatever you're dealing with. One time I had a mindfulness class I was teaching at Lewis and Clark Graduate School and Graduate School of Education and Counseling. And what I did was I had people go outside and commune with nature for about 20 minutes. Now, when we're children, it's very normal for us to be in a magical place, right? The French have a term déjà vu, meaning I've been there before, but they also have a term jamais vu, which means never having been there before. And so I noticed when I went outside, I was watching these students connect with nature, that one woman was on all fours, kind of moving very slowly on the ground, on the grass. We came back in and I asked people to give their experiences, and her hand shot up. And I said, well, yes, I'd love to hear what you experienced, because I saw you there on the kind of hard to miss you on all fours on the ground. And she said, I had the most amazing thing happen. I was watching a worm. And she said, my sense of who I was just disappeared. And I kind of became one with the worm. Which way was it going to go? Right. She said it was the most mesmerizing experience. Was it going to go through? Was it going to wriggle to the right, to the left? But she had regained that wonderful sense of childhood that we all have.
Well, I have to ask, did she pass your course? So,
oh, she got the top grade.
yeah, that's good. No, that's wonderful. And I liked how you've said it before, getting out of one's own head. And in previous shows, I don't know if this is at least the second time, perhaps the third time you've been on our show. And you, something you talked about mental clarity was the pause and simply walking away from what you're doing at the moment. And I have stolen that, and I've written about it. And sometimes I mention your name, sometimes I don't. But it's good. But you're adding to this now with explain what you mean by silence. So,
well, silence is that reflective moment. So think about how we live today. Our phones are in front of our faces all the time. We're looking at screens. We're getting all these different messages coming to us, text messages, email, where, we're constantly bringing our attention outside of ourselves. And we've kind of lost, I think, the ability to just reflect and go inward. There was even a study that was fascinating that showed how people are somewhat afraid even of sitting with their own thoughts. In this study, they brought these subjects into this room and they said we're taking away your phone. They kept their phone for the first part of the study. And they said, we just want to see what it's like for you to sit in this room, but we don't want you to use your phone. Well, over half of the people lied, said they didn't use their phone, but they were being observed through a one-way mirror, and half the people looked at their phone. So in the second part of the study, they said, how many of you would like to be, what is your feeling about being shocked by an electric shock? And everybody said, I would never want an electric shock. No electric shock for me. So then they brought them into the room for the second part. They took away their phone, but there was a device in the room that could self-administer an electric shock. And they showed them, in case you're interested, here's how this device works. All these people who said they wouldn't give themselves an electric shock had no phone, nothing to distract them. Over 50% of the people gave themselves shocks. They self-administered a shock rather than sit with their thoughts. Now, that's pretty wild, isn't it?
So, the idea of they administered a shock to avoid being with their thoughts, is that what you...
Yeah, to keep themselves busy.
Okay.
Distracted in some way.
That's a dramatic story.
Well, and I think that's part of the psychiatrist in my story. He is keeping himself busy all the time. Finally, he has to confront this idea. He goes to see somebody to help him at some point, an old supervisor of his. He thinks he's losing his mind with all these things that are happening around him. And, she talks to him also about silence. And she even quotes Vivekananda, who was a Hindu sage who brought a lot of Eastern ideas to the West back in the 1900s. Or I'm sorry, the 1800s, 19th century. And one of Vivekananda's quote is, the infinite library of the universe is in your own mind, right? But to tap that universe, you have to find stillness. And this psychiatrist, he's keeping him busy reading journal articles. He never has a moment to really sit. Also, it helps him avoid his grief. Right?
That's exactly what I was. That's exactly my question there. So, do we keep ourselves occupied because of, well, I don't know, fear of boredom or fear of who we are? What's your perspective on that, Donald?
Well, yeah, that's a good point. Good question. I think it can be a lot of things. I think it can be fear of who we are, fear of having distressing thoughts, which actually it's been shown that that's normal. The average person, I would ask our audience out there, have you counted the number of thoughts you had today? And most people would kind of be shocked to even think about that. But the average person has at minimum about 20,000 thoughts per day. And how many of those thoughts tell you something profound about who you are? Most of those are just maybe conditioned thoughts, right? Habitual thoughts, or sometimes even just randomly distressing thoughts, which has been found that our brain just will create that, right? But if you take those seriously, then that could lead to a lot of distress, right? So we need to know how to separate from that. And one of the ideas in travelers also is that we're bigger than just the thoughts that we have, right? And so people are diagnosed a lot of times by, oh, you're having these thoughts, you're ruminating, that's depression, that's we give names to all these things. What I'm saying too is that if we could get away from the pathological nature of all of this diagnostic labeling, because a lot of patients have come in to see me and they'll say, oh, I'm a depressive, or I'm a bipolar, or I'm a, and so they put themselves now in this little box. And sure, some of those symptoms could be helpful in terms of knowing how to treat somebody. And I'm not saying that there's not a benefit to that.
Right.
The downside is when we start labeling ourselves, right, and limiting ourselves as a result of that.
Great. Well, let's explore this, because you're an expert in mindfulness. You taught it, and you have taught it at graduate level and workshop level, and you keynote presentations, and you've written a number of books on it. So, and your thinking has helped me deal with it. So I want to talk about getting back to the silence stuff. Is there an exercise you might recommend if someone wants to encounter silence? Is it through meditation, or is there another technique that you might recommend, Donald? So,
I think there are a lot of different ways, and really all my books have a lot of practices in them. But I think one of the best is just to sit and take a breath and imagine breathing in. You could breathe in anything that you think you need in this moment. Maybe you need compassion. Maybe you could breathe in understanding. Maybe you need some love in this moment. So you could take a breath. May I experience love, and then breathe out love to all beings. So we could take in something for ourselves that we need and breathe it out for all beings. May I find patience. If you're the kind of person that has a short fuse, maybe, and so may I be patient. May all beings be patient, right? Yeah. And you could do this for a minute. The great thing about and that will also quiet your mind, because you're focusing your mind on this affirmation or mantra, whatever you want to call it, and you're helping your thoughts settle. And you're also, by doing this, taking a breath in, you're also regulating. You're turning on the parasympathetic nervous system of the body, which lowers your pulse rate, respiration, blood pressure, and so on. It's called the relaxation system of the body. So you're actually turning that on. And so even just taking one of those breaths, I was actually involved in a study with priests at the University of Portland. I was called in because they were wondering, these priests that were working there, working in very impoverished parishes here in Portland, and many of them were older and they'd been identified with some heart conditions, and they're wondering, well, they knew actually that a mindfulness practice would help, but going through a traditional mindfulness-based stress reduction practice is a real time commitment, right? So, and 45 to an hour a day after the training. So they asked me if I could design a brief mindfulness intervention. So I did it was 2 1-hour trainings. And then what I had them do, I taught them, I called it contemplative breathing. I didn't even use the word mindfulness, because these were priests, and they were steeped in contemplation.
Sure.
So I think we can, really adapt the vocabulary to however we want. And so I had them combine it with prayer. We talked, and how would they want to use it? So some would do it with prayer, but I had them just do 3 minutes at a time, 3 minutes at a time, 3 times a day, 9 minutes a day. And we pre-tested their blood pressure, pulse rate, and all that, and gave them a stress called the perceived stress scale test before and after at the end of a month. And their scores significantly dropped. Their stresses dropped, their blood pressure, they were actually healthier for just 9 minutes a day.
That's wonderful. That's my style. 3 minutes times three a day. So I got time.
Yeah.
I have time for that. I think many of us do. But I think that's what's important there. And getting back to you mentioned something about love. Dr. Ben in the novel, going back, suffered a tremendous loss of his daughter. So is he on a spiritual quest for love, or is it understanding, or is it both? What were you seeking to explore, Donald? So,
Yeah, I think he was on a spiritual quest definitely on a spiritual quest and for understanding about love, because his daughter was so loving, and he felt he had gotten more and more constricted over time, and had lost touch with people, and so he he reaches kind of a crux in the story where he has to overcome his fear, right, and embrace the moment and experience love. And without giving anything away, that happens. I think one of the interesting things that happened to me was at that kind of a climax time in the story where he's taking part of his spiritual journey in a wilderness area that's it's probably about an hour and a half outside of Portland. And I've actually hiked in that park. It's a wilderness park. But while I was hiking through, months after I'd written the novel, I fell in the same area that the character fell and had sustained some of the same injuries. Good thing my wife was there to help me get out. And the character didn't have that benefit, but afterwards, and I'd written that about a part of the park I had never been to. I just used my imagination, and I was shocked. I had described it just as it was.
That's extraordinary. So
yeah.
you were so you became a character you were one of the travelers there. So, I love it. Donald, I could go on and on speaking to you, but we're coming to the end of it. And as you know, I forgot to ask you at the beginning of this, but do you have a story about grace that you wish to share? So,
I think grace is in how we can approach the next person we meet and show them forbearance, show them kindness. And if we could do that, and think about that as a goal for the day.
That is all. I love how you framed that, and because that's really what grace is: looking at people with an open heart. I like you're using the term forbearance. It's not a word that comes up every day, but it explains itself, and there's a sense of understanding in it, and that is your life's work, my friend. You have been teaching us to understand ourselves better, and in return, give back to others what we can. So the new book is Travelers. Where can we find it, and where can we find you, Donald? So,
well, you can find the book at it's on Amazon.com, Barnes and Noble. It's on all the independent booksellers. If you went to your bookstore, you'd be able to order it from them. So however you want to find it, you can find me at mindfulpractices.com. That's MINDFUL practices.com, and you can see all my books and the different work that I'm doing up there, CDs and online programs and so on.
Right. Donald, always good to see you. And with that, we're going to close out the program, and I say thank you.
Well, blessings to you, my friend.